By the early 1940s, the world had reached its breaking point. Hitler's totalitarian regime had taken over Europe, and the Allies mobilized to fight back. World War II remarkably affected American society, especially influencing the role of women. The movement of women into industry had first begun during the Industrial Revolution, following the oppressive cult of domesticity that defined the role of women throughout the 19th century. But World War II sparked the largest, fastest transition of women into traditionally men's jobs. The Women Air Force service pilots were one of the most important and influential American groups in World War II and the 20th century women's rights movement in the military, which they established through the completion of domestic missions, testing of military aircraft, and perseverance in the face of doubt towards their worth. The WASP were important in World War II because of their completion of domestic missions. One of the most notable instances of this was when they ferried planes to military bases in preparation for D-Day, one of the most important battles in the war in terms of Allied gains. Several WASP flew C-47s and P-51s, two planes that were vital to the success of D-Day, as they were used to transport soldiers and cut off Nazis from the beaches. Without the WASP ferrying these planes, D-Day would not have received the aircraft and been the win it was. Another way the WASP's domestic missions were important was that, with women taking over non-combat roles in the Air Force, more male pilots could be sent overseas to fight. This was important because it monumentally increased the Allied aerial force while also keeping the level of efficiency in the transport and testing of military aircraft steady. This documentary, published in the Army-Navy Screen magazine in 1943, describes what the WASP do on a daily basis.
Even before they get a chance to take the polish off their nails, it's out onto a dusty Texas drill field with them. Right away, the Air Force wants to get a little muscle on those pretty arms.
The video's purpose is to defend the idea of women in the Air Force and motivate women to join, while also assuring the public that the women's service will not make them any less ladylike. Although these sorts of sexist ideas would ultimately be the downfall of the program,
that she's still the softer, fairer sex, worried to death she's going to get her hair wet.
This video shows that during the war, the weight of the work the WASP did was somewhat acknowledged by the public as necessary to winning the war, which would change the way that many people saw women in the military. The WASP were also influential in the war and the field of flight through the testing of military aircraft. One of their most significant contributions was the testing of the Martin B-26 Marauder, an aerodynamic plane perfect for dropping and carrying bombs. It was nicknamed the Widowmaker for all the accidents it had caused due to design issues, which had since been fixed. However, male pilots refused to fly these planes due to their previously dangerous condition. The WASP tested them and quickly identified the limitations of the planes to prevent future crashes, which caused the stigma around the Marauder to dissipate. The Allies added nearly 5,300 new planes to their stockpile, a direct effect of the WASP's work which helped build the arsenal that would eventually end the war. Another plane the WASP tested was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which was notorious for deadly engine fires that caused pilots to panic and crash. One military official believed that the WASP could navigate it after being awestruck by their flight skills, so two women were trained in the controls of the plane. They flew perfectly, even through two engines conking out and another on fire, which proved to terrified male pilots that the plane could be flown, even with only one engine out of the four working. Remembering how he felt after seeing these phenomenal women fly the Superfortress, Brigadier General Paul Tibbets described his personal experience with the influence of the WASP around the B-29 in an interview to Texas Women's University in 1997, remarking, "Those two girls ought to be given the credit because they did the job, and I don't know how we could have gotten people to fly B-29 airplanes without them." His point of view in the entire interview was that the WASP were suited for their job, and they were a significant force in driving men to be more adventurous pilots. His statements solidify the importance of the WASP and confirm the great extent to which they transformed flight. Additionally, the Enola Gay, which dropped the bomb on Hiroshima in 1945, was a B-29. The atomic bombing effectively ended the war in the Pacific theater and would not have been possible without the contribution of the WASP in the plane's testing. Later on, the WASP's work proved useful once again, as the B-29 was utilized in remote, top-secret government test sites during the Cold War as a modified bomber for attack on the Soviet Union. The experimentation on the B-29 was also crucial to the development of missile guidance systems. Without the WASP's test flights of this plane, none of this research would have been possible. As the first women to fly for the United States Air Force, the WASP were trailblazers in the fight for equality in the armed forces, and although their perseverance was largely unsuccessful during the time period, it resulted in future change to women's rights in the Air Force. It was unusual for women to be in the armed forces, which represented the American ideal of manliness. As a result, there was significant discrimination and sexism in the Air Force as women took over men's military roles. These photos show two WASP instructing men in pilot training. The context of these images is that the WASP persevered by being forced to fly more than the required amount of hours for male cadets to be accepted into the Air Force, as well as completing the same training as men. Despite having to do more to prove that they were capable, many made it through the grueling training process, and as a result, they were entrusted with the instruction of incoming male cadets, which had previously been reserved for experienced male officers. These women reached the necessary qualifications in a short time and entered into a man's job that had never before been occupied by women, a revolutionary step in advancing equality in the military. However, the WASP were kept just below the level of male pilots in that they weren't allowed to fly combat missions. Another example of the WASP's perseverance is the statistics showing that they had a lower accident rate than male pilots in the same positions, despite being given battered, defective training planes that caused several WASP deaths. They excelled in their training and assignments and rose above the capabilities of many male pilots, proving yet again to the Air Force that they were worthy of the same recognition as men. Their initial advancements towards equality resulted in a short-term change in which women were sought out to navigate the skies. Unfortunately, temporary defeat came in 1944 when a movie directed by John Rawlins came out called Ladies Courageous, which depicted the WASP as flirty and gossipy.
Not only is your flying record shot, but you're giving all of your time and attention to pilots instead of ships. Roberta, did you know that Alex and Jill were married? Did you know that Jill just crashed an hour ago? But I didn't know they were married. I didn't know. If you stuck to your job, you wouldn't have been involved in it.
The purpose of this movie was to explain the role of the WASP in the Air Force, but it portrayed them as dramatic, silly girls. Coupled with the imminent pressure for jobs from returning male pilots, many congressmen were convinced that the women had fulfilled their duties to their country and were not cut out for military life, resulting in the disbanding of the WASP in late 1944. As shown by innumerable pieces of evidence, the WASP were one of the most important driving forces in the advancement of women's rights in the Air Force and were crucial to the Allied victory in World War II. In the following time period, consensus culture in the 1950s would stifle this step towards equality for over 30 years, calling for a return to normalcy after the war. Despite many setbacks, the 1977 acknowledgement of the WASP's service by awarding them veteran status inspired many women to strive to be pilots. And in 2010, several remaining members were presented with the Congressional Gold Medal, both of which were the beginning of another era of fighting for equality in the Air Force for women. The WASP were pioneers of the sky, whose innovative flight techniques and infinite bravery, despite harsh requirements from the Air Force and the disbelief of the public that women could fly airplanes, became the core of the mobilization of the Air Force in World War II, and their legacy continues to inspire women pilots up to today.